Natural You listeners. Today I have a very special guest. His name is Muji Zia, and I met him a few weeks back in the middle of September at a festival called the All Things Fungi Festival. And I was on my own. It was the first time I'd been to a festival like this, and I saw a guy on the speaking, and I hadn't really planned my itinerary, but I thought, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. So I went and sat in the crowd, and this guy came out, and he looked like an intriguing sort of guy, and his voice was just really calm and smooth, and he had a real blend of science and intuition, which is totally my bag, as you probably know. And he really impressed me, not only with his knowledge and the subject matter, but also his manner. There was one guy in the audience who sort of about halfway through interjected and had this question, which was totally not related, in my opinion, to the subject matter, and he wanted some information from Muji. And the way that he handled it, and he just answered that guy's question in a very patient way, and that really impressed me. And so afterwards, I went and said hi, and then I went to find him at his stall. He was selling some wonderful tonic, some cola tonic, and this amazing chai, these teas that he made. And so we started chatting a bit more, and that's when I realized I wanted to get him on the Natural You podcast. So welcome, Muji.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. How lovely to hear that introduction.
Cool, man. And I just wanted to tell the listeners a little bit about you. So I'm just going to kind of read off your bio from your website, which is forestmedicine.org. Muji completed his BSc and MSc in pharmacy at the University of Bath in the UK. He then went on to do an MSc in forest ecology and sustainable management from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. He's currently an associate member of the Institute of Chartered Foresters. He's also a member of the Royal Forestry Society, British Ecological Society, and British Mycology Society. So he has these broad interests in pharmacology and pharmacy, and then also how that interrelates with ecology. And so I'm really fascinated by it because I also have this sort of science bent and interested in holistic thinking. So Muji, tell us how you're a little bit about your journey, how you got into pharmacy, and then how that led into the sort of more ecology side.
Yeah, for sure, Tim. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So yeah, as it says on my website, that I studied pharmacy at the University of Bath, and I really enjoyed my studies. I liked it a lot. I learned a lot. There's a lot of medicinal chemistry, clinical medicine, clinical pharmacy, and Bath, such a beautiful place as well. So I finished that, and graduated. That must be it's a long time ago. After that, I started to practice, and I was not so interested in practicing pharmacy, not in the community setting. So I stopped and went to go and learn about growing food and then growing medicines in the UK. And then I decided to go and apprentice as a medical herbalist in the US. So I went to go and apprentice with a really wonderful teacher. Her name is Susanna Raven in New York, Albany. So I did that. I came back, apprenticed with some other herbalists here, started practicing, and then started growing professionally medicinal plants for Trill Farm down in Devon. And then after that, set up and started growing medicinal plants myself, and then using more of a forest garden model for growing them. So not necessarily in rows, which I was used to doing, but then trying to understand the interaction between plants and wondering what that does for the medicinal activity of the plants, and also to create a more ecologically harmonious and ecologically balanced agricultural system. So I'm growing medicinal plants, but not necessarily in rows. So shifting more towards a forest model rather than an agricultural model. So I did that in Hungary. And I was also doing parts of that in the US. And then I set up a forest garden, which I can share a little bit about that. And then I wanted to scale that up, but I realized that I couldn't really do that with the knowledge I had of what was it, like organic agriculture. I did Martin Crawford's forest garden course, at the Dartington estate. He's a brilliant, brilliant man. And then I decided that what I really would like to do is really to understand how forests work, how do they interact with each other, how those different species interact. What does it mean if a forest is healthy? So I've been learning what it means for a person or human to be healthy or diseased. And then I wanted to understand what does it mean? How would I know if a forest is healthy or not? So I went and applied to study my master's in the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences up in Umeå, so quite far north in Sweden. And for some reason they accepted me, and I went to study with them, my master's in forest ecology. And I did learn. I mean, there's so much to learn, but I learned a lot about what keeps forests. What does it mean for a forest to be healthy, look healthy? Um, and to understand and speak the language of an ecologist, I think it's incredibly valuable. It's incredibly valuable. So that's what I did. That's the journey.
And so the language, just to kind of go on to that point, the language of the ecologist, what is that? How does it give you access to different aspects? And have you noticed it crossing over into your medicinal plants and things like that? And how has that language and insight changed things for you?
Yeah. Good question. So I think, I mentioned in perhaps not the talk that, yeah, I did probably mention in that talk that you were at, Tim, at the All Things Fungi Festival, but I guess it's the left and the right hemisphere, how they work differently. The left hemisphere predominantly, relies on quite linear formats, and it works quite well with decontextualized information. So it lends itself well to a reductionist scientific methodology. So it's become quite a useful tool in that sense. Whereas the right hemisphere, more or less, I know it's not so simple as what I'm portraying, but it deals with information in a more contextualized manner, a more relationship based, and a lot more variables can be taken up and into account with the right hemisphere, which is how we can appreciate a piece of art or appreciate a forest with all of its components. We don't necessarily understand the mechanisms of each interaction all the time, which is the premise of the left hemisphere, but we can take in and somehow we can comprehend with the right hemisphere that which we can't comprehend with the left. And so I think it was that tending towards that, or at least being comfortable shifting between both, that the ecologists are very good at, and the way that they see forests, they don't really impose a value or judgment onto it. I think in medicine we find that death and disease are usually bad. They're negative outputs of the system, so that's usually what we're trying to avoid. But I think in ecology, it's a much more balanced approach between life and death, and we recognize and we really look at those mechanisms, those dynamics that give rise to, for example, saprotrophic fungi breaking down organic matter, and then what that means for nutrient cycling and different elements. So
It's
that's an
fascinating.
example.
I mean, for me, it's really, I've always had this pull between the reductionist science, which helps us gain these valuable insights into single mechanisms. And we love it, right? It just gives us such clear information, and it's just such a useful tool. But it's so wholly inadequate when we want to look at the whole ecosystem, or even a holistic system. It just, we are greater than the sum of the parts. And how do ecological scientists, how do they put that together, and how do they use those individual parts, or do they not use them? Is there no reductionism, or they use it partially? I'm very curious, because if we can find a way to use this in healthcare or in general whole systems thinking, it would just be a whole new way of researching and a whole new way of gaining knowledge. If you have some insights, I'd just love to hear them. I'm sure the people listening would be.
Well, yeah. That is like that's the chalice, isn't it? That is it. That's what we're talking about. And I think we're tending towards that with personalized medicine. In biotechnology, I think they're trying to tend towards taking a more holistic picture or taking a wider viewpoint, but also trying to be personalized and specific. So it seems paradoxical.
Yeah, I was just about to say it seems even more reductionistic because instead of what's applicable to everyone is to one person only because of your microbiome, your genetics, your thing, we can look at all those things.
Yeah, so I think perhaps I can make reference to my research in Sweden and looking at, I mean, we touched on it in the talk, but for example, we were cultivating chaga.
So can you tell people what chaga is?
Yeah, so chaga is a parasitic fungus which grows on birch trees, and it starts to digest the heartwood, so the dead part of the tree, and leaving for the most part the cambium and the living tissues intact. But it parasitizes the tree, which means it's using the birch tree as a food source. It will contribute to the death of the tree. It doesn't necessarily kill the tree. It contributes to its demise, we can say. But in the years that it takes for that to happen, chaga throws out it's an immune response between the birch and the chaga mycelium. Throws out these little conchs, sterile conchs, sclerotia. And they've been traditionally harvested by the Sami in Fennoscandia. The Sami are the indigenous peoples of Lapland and in Russia, and these, above the Arctic Circle, the reindeer herders. So they've been harvesting them, taking them in a very sustainable manner. They take the conch away from the tree, they grind it up, and they basically decoct it. So they boil it up, and then it extracts the medicinal compounds into the water, and then they drink it as a kind of coffee. You could say, we would say it's like a coffee, but it's a decoction of the. It's not a mushroom. It's not a fruiting body. It's the sclerotia. But anyway, there are many medicinal compounds responsible for Chaga's medicinal actions. So there's the obvious one is the melanin, which you can see there's a black layer on the outer part of that, and that's a melanized outer layer, and that's extracted. And melanin is one of the most potent antioxidant compounds that we know of in the natural world, and that's one of its actions in the body as an antioxidant, and in terms of protecting genetic material in the body and kind of scavenging reactive oxygen species, that kind of mechanism to prevent genetic damage at the gene level. The other compounds that are present are the triterpene compounds, that fraction, betulinic acid and such like, and they have their own activity in cancer prevention and lots of different things that they do with the immune system, interacting with the immune system to prevent inflammation and to prevent cancer mechanisms of cancer, which is complicated in itself. And then there's there's the polysaccharide fraction, the micropolysaccharide fraction, which are present in many of the medicinal mushrooms that we use commonly now. So that's also present. So what we were researching in Sweden was the fastest growing strain, because we know that it takes a long time to grow chaga. So we wanted to find the fastest growing strain because that was the kind of bottleneck in chaga cultivation. And foresters were not really keen to take it up because it takes so long. So we wanted to find the fastest growing strain. But in doing so, and as I mentioned in the talk, it may be that we compromise the production of secondary metabolites, which are responsible for the medicinal activity. So by encouraging and prioritizing primary metabolism, which we would see in faster growth, that we may compromise secondary metabolite production. So I proposed that we
not as strong medicinally if it grows fast.
Say again.
So it's not as strong medicinally if it grows too fast. So the
Yeah,
slower
well,
the
exactly.
process, the greater the buildup of these kind of metabolites, if you were, and those are the things that have the medicinal properties. So
exactly. That was exactly my thinking. Yeah. And actually, the results of our research hinted at that occurring. So the fastest strains although it wasn't statistically significant over all treatments. It hinted that the fastest growing strains actually produced the least melanin, and the slower growing strains produced the most melanin. But it was quite inconsistent, and we needed a bigger study to really prove that. Yeah, kind of irrefutably prove it. But I think that's definitely the next steps. But the point is that I was coming to answer your question is there's a whole profile of chemical constituents in this just one medicinal species. There's a whole profile of, so firstly, we're trying to understand what the actions of each of those are in the body. Then we're trying to understand the interactions of them in the body. And then we're trying to understand which therapeutic aims are achievable. So, for example, somebody has intense inflammation. Okay, so which compounds from this one species would be the most suitable, and then how would we extract that and deliver that? Somebody has a propensity towards cancer or a particular type of cancer. Okay, with this one species, which compounds would be the most appropriate for this particular condition? So, just in one species, what I mean is there's a whole profile of constituents, which we know somewhat. We know some of them, and we know some of their actions in the body. We do know that, but we don't really know how they interact with each other, and we don't really know, for example, if we're growing chaga at this latitude in this way, what the quality of the chaga would come out as. And that's true for all medicinal species and all medicinal plants. We don't really know, unless we do very intense chemical analysis for each sample. We don't know what we're getting. So that gives rise to the pharmaceutical model of taking one constituent. We know that constituent, we know the purity of it, and then we know the quantity of it. So that's what's given rise to the pharmaceutical left hemisphere model, is that it's less complex, it's more intense, but it's measurable, and it's comprehensible from the left hemisphere perspective. So that's always the playoff. That's always the dynamic.
We had a medical herbalist on earlier in the year, Craig Wright, and he was kind of saying the same thing. And sometimes when you take that so-called active ingredient out of the association with the other ones, it doesn't have the effect. So it's only an active ingredient when it has these cofactors or these co-activators.
Yeah.
And it may be, and it probably is, that they all work together in different ways, and that's why it's so wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. And in ways that we probably wouldn't be able to predict. And there's a lot of side effects may be curtailed by the fact that other constituents are present. For example, tannins would be present that might protect the gut lining from a salicylate, for example, or lots of different mechanisms.
So nature packages it together for us to in that way.
Yeah.
And, experience has taught us that they work together. And, so that's fascinating. So so you've got the kind of whole within the chaga, you've got all the kind of co-elements that give rise to these each individual. You've got the terpenes and the melanin and the polysaccharides, and they all have their own individual effects, but together they probably have a even greater effect. And trying to piece those together. So do we? It's kind of, do we have to spend time, money, and effort to isolate those, or can just say, hang on, this as an individual thing, let's just use that? It just seems much more like, hey, we know it, let's do it. Do we have to pull out all of those micro ingredients to find that specific super molecule, that magic bullet?
Yeah. Very well said. I think that's really well said, actually, Tim, because I think that's my own feeling, and it might just be because I'm inherently lazy, but it could just be the fact that, okay, we're isolating all these things and then we're increasing the concentration of them so we can achieve a certain, but actually, like you said, the synergy that would be just from the fact that there are different compounds working at different points, different markers in the body, may well achieve those results and more, because when you isolate a compound and you increase the dosage, usually you get indiscriminate effects in the body which result in side effects or adverse events. So that's usually why that happens. So yeah, if you have a lower dose of something, that's a much more diverse kind of cocktail. Usually you get a lower side of more or less side effects occurring, especially if they're co-evolved with you. I mean, I'm not saying that all plants and all species are good for you just because they're natural, but certain species have co-evolved with us and our use, and we know that they're
Yeah, and that word you used there, synergy. I'm assuming that's one of those words that came out of your ecological studies. You know,
yeah,
those the synergistic elements, and it reminded me of what's becoming more popular is these ideas of stacks. So you've got the Stamets stack for brain health, and so it's these compounds that seem to help each other. And it's
yeah,
almost like nature has done its own stack.
yeah, yeah,
And so we can take, we can, if we're doing an exercise program, if we stack this exercise with that exercise, we'll get this result.
right, yeah,
But
yeah,
if we just looked at chopping wood, it would be that same stack, right? So let's just
yeah,
chop wood.
yeah,
But we have to break it down in the gym to these pulls and these pushes and this
yeah,
thing, whereas the natural environment provides that for us already. And so it made me think of that sort of synergism, those stacking of different things. And I like the idea of the lower dose all working together, having a profound effect without the side effects. And I think, I mean, that just sounds beautiful. But of
yeah,
course, you can't patent those. So there's probably not going to be a huge drive to
yeah.
separate those out anyway.
Yeah, I like that idea as well, and it feels like it feels more elegant. It feels more elegant in that way, and that's I feel like nature is very elegant and graceful, and nothing is superfluous to need, and it's just still beautiful and functional and efficient, but it doesn't take away from the beauty like how we make things efficient. But so
Yeah,
everything
I
is
love that you're bringing in um, that right brain, right? It's like those other words, the
yeah,
beauty and the elegance.
yeah,
You can say, "Oh, this is an elegant study," but that's just because you think that's very neat and concise, right? It's not necessarily elegant in the diversity of
yeah,
something like you see in a forest or in a chaga conch. There's a
yeah.
different elegance to that, isn't there?
I couldn't hear the last thing you said, Tim. Just the
I
last
said
one.
there's the synergy and the elegance is in the complexity and the
Yes.
interconnectedness, rather than something that's very well structured. Like we might say it's an elegant study, but it's just very well structured with what they mean. It's not
Yeah.
truly elegant
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
in a
Yeah. Yeah.
complex way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And those concepts from ecology, and have you come across any ways of researching and thinking and new forms of evidence that other than the pure reductionist model of then taking pieces and trying to put them together and then connect them? Is there a more kind of a whole system developing you see, or are we still very reliant on this reductionist model to give us what we call evidence or
So, is your question, Tim? Are there any other methodologies that we can use to arise arrive at this different, more holistic conclusion?
yes.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of like good statistical analyses, so take into consideration a lot of different variables now that people are trying to use. So it's not just like one variable testing against, a dependent variable. But I feel like we have so much knowledge at our hands, and ecologically, there's so many variables at play that could interact. For example, I don't know if we're looking at, I don't know, nitrogen in the soil or carbon in the soil. I mean, when I was working for the Forestry Commission, all the models looking at carbon sequestration and planting for carbon and which species to plant for carbon. They're all relying on data that only works with above ground carbon. So that led to what did that lead to? Quite predictably, looking at the fastest growing species. So, for example, it would be a coniferous species or pine or western red cedar or something like that. And I think that's so. And because we don't have the data to say what's happening underground with different species, you know, I was questioning certain people working with the carbon credit scheme and the carbon sequestration data. You know, they're showing us a graph of different tree species and how much carbon they sequester. And of course, Sitka spruce came out on top. And from a carbon perspective, that's going to stimulate the planting of a lot of Sitka spruce to sequester carbon. But that's on data looking at above ground carbon sequestration. Now, if you start to incorporate below ground carbon sequestration, mycelial networks, the rest of the ecosystem that relies or will rely on that tree, and vice versa, then you might see a different picture emerging, because you might see the more native species, or more lowland species. You might see oak doing very, very well because of the different species that start to associate with it, which is also carbon. The lichen and the mosses that associate it with also carbon. The mycelia and the different fungi that associate it, which is also carbon. The different biota and the different, fauna that associate with oak. And it's not just that one tree. Perhaps in a constellation, there are different species that sequester carbon on a whole system level at a much higher level than perhaps Sitka spruce at the above ground individual tree level. So what I mean to say is, in response to your question, is that if we're looking at things in a very individualistic way and waiting for data to come along, rather than actually using our intuition and saying, our intuition is powerful, and I don't think that we should make all decisions based on it. I think it should be reasoned out, but also, it makes sense that, okay, this species isn't adapted to this particular area. And yes, the data says that it sequesters the most carbon, but what are the limitations of that data? What are the limitations of that work? And actually, it does make sense that if we were to plant an oak birch forest in this area, which it was traditionally before we turned it into agricultural fields, perhaps that might be the most appropriate forest type for this area. And not only would it sequester potentially more carbon than a Sitka spruce plantation, but it would encourage much more biodiversity, and it'd be a much better for the soil. And all those things are carbon, and it is, if they're not incorporated into the models.
And even then, you say you've got all these different forms of carbon, but you say, what if that's only one? You're only answering the carbon question. How valuable is biodiversity for humanity and the planet? Apparently, it needs saving. But aren't those important too? So you're looking for a single answer, and then going, "Oh, we found the answer,"
Yeah,
but ignoring all the other stuff. And like you say,
exactly.
our intuition can guide us, and I think we can better look to nature to see how she's done it and say,
Yeah,
this works really well over millennia, and these are things that are going to suit that. And maybe in the short term, maybe the short term gain in the spruce is a long term net loss
yes,
in
yeah.
not
I
just
think,
carbon, but everything. All
yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's the way to go. And there are, to be fair, I've seen some really good papers and good research showing the inclusion of this species, what the effect of that is on biodiversity, what the effect of that is on soil structure and friability and mineral content, what's the effect of that species on water flowing through that particular landscape. So, then you can create a profile of species, but it's very, there are so many variables. That species in that place might have that profile, but in another place it has a different profile. So
and
it's so
I
nuanced
mean
and so
it's
many
so
variables.
nuanced, and that complexity and the number of variables, we just don't have the brains to comprehend it.
No,
And even maybe AI is going to help us be able to piece and parcel some of those, but we still have to give it the information, right? It's like it's not going to do it for us, and it's almost so overwhelming that we
hmm
just kind of go, it's too complex. I'm just going to go back here because that's just
yeah,
really easy. And because we all know how to, if we're scientists, we know how to design a study, right? It's quite, once you know the basics, it's quite easy, and you just keep doing that, and you just tweak which variable you're going to change. And so, that's not that hard in science to do that. Once you know the rules of the game, you can play them. And so, those people are never going to want to switch from tennis to squash, right? Because it's
right,
a whole different
right, right,
rules.
right, right, right. Yeah,
And let alone adding in, let's combine tennis and squash to create paddle tennis. And then it gets even more complicated. And and let's change the surface and put lights in and strobe lights and
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and you have to play it fasted, and then
Yeah.
so you just it's like, you could just make it crazy, and it's so complex and varied that we don't know the rules. Or maybe they maybe picked out a few of them. We go, okay, well, we know this lane, and I just kind of wondered, can ecology ever take all those pieces and we can connect some of the dots, but at what point do we just go, let's just run with what we've got?
Yes, it's a big task. I mean, but we see the same thing playing out in medicine. I mean, if you look at medicine and how the human body is compartmentalized into different disciplines and specialisms, it is again, as you said, Tim, it's just so overwhelming that each specialist realizes that it's not possible for them to understand it in its entirety. So they just focus on their own department and specialism, and in that sense, I guess it furthers the divide. Although we go deeper, into each person goes deeper, each practitioner goes deeper into their aspect. It furthers the divide. So I suppose it's getting the balance right between breadth and depth.
I think it raises the question of, you spoke about medicine and how we have specialism. So let's say you decide to become a cardiothoracic surgeon, right? And so you start operating on the heart, and then you go, well, I'm only going to look at the left side of the heart, and then I'm only going to look at the left ventricle, and then I'm only going to look at the valves to the left ventricle, and then that's all you're doing, surgeries on this one spine. So you know more and more about less and less. Perhaps what we're missing is the expert generalist. So someone like yourself who's got pharmacy and then ecology
Yeah.
is able to give so much more insight into those things, and maybe we should be pushing those people who learn broader and then can go deeper rather than narrow and then just get refining the super tight
Yes, I think so.
small area of expertise, and this kind of expert generalist. And perhaps in our schooling we should be encouraging that all the way through. And I know some countries do that better than others, but then when we get to higher education, it's just like, well, you have to choose, are you doing zoology or botany? And then botany, do you look at fungi? No. It's like, well, where do they fit in? Well, and I had to choose that when I got to university. I had to choose botany or zoology, and I chose zoology, and that took me into human physiology. My mom was a botanist, and so I always kind of valued the plant side of it, but she knew nothing about fungi. It was like, this one's edible, the rest are poisonous. And so that always stuck with me. And so now that I'm becoming interested in fungi, it's just like, wow, it's just so huge and even more complex than the flora
Yeah.
out there. And it's just so complex and a whole new area. And maybe we just need people with broader knowledge earlier on, and then we can have area of specialization, but there needs to be this cross pollination.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, Tim. I think, we go back to the Renaissance, or we go back to like the Arab Golden Ages or the European Renaissance. We see polymaths quite frequently arising. Well, obviously we don't really know how frequent they were, but it seems that was more of a thing to have polymaths arise, and they have mastery over multiple disciplines. And that's because, and I think it's a shifting. Now we might go into a little bit more philosophical, esoteric shift, but I think what happens, if I can say it, what happens slowly over time, it seems like a concretizing of the material world, and that when we introduce more and more technologies, for example, writing or letters, numbers, these are types of technology, and now we have even more advanced technology. It lends itself to a further and further abstraction, which is the realms of the left hemisphere, and the right hemisphere is not able to keep up with that level of abstraction, so it becomes kind of atrophied, less visited, and we can no longer exercise that way of dealing with information or dealing with our lived experience in a very open, broad, as you mentioned, and still yet very interactive way. We struggle to do that because we're so often dealing with abstractions, even in the virtual sense, and even with our books and these kind of things. We're so often dealing with abstractions of things that represent a reality, but it is not actually that reality. So we're struggling to relate, and that translates into our relationship with the living world. It translates with our relationship to each other, and it translates to our relationship with the spiritual dimension also. So that concretizing is aided by technology, and it's the realm, yeah, like I said, it's the realm of the left hemisphere, and we have to be a little bit, I think, aware of,
So would
I think, of that
concretizing be the
phenomena.
same as would concretizing be the same or similar to materialism?
Yeah, yeah. Concrete. What do I mean by that? Yeah, so like, yeah,
No, I'm just trying to find. I mean, I understand the concrete. You're condensing it. You're making it more kind of substantial.
yeah,
Um, and it deals with the material world, but without any connection to it. And perhaps the remedy, you're looking for remedies to this one hemisphericity,
yeah,
is to obviously engage the other side. And how do we do that for people? And how do we allow people to access that, to become broad in their
yeah,
experience and senses of knowing? And perhaps one of those is just to actually get people to engage with nature and to sit with it in an
yeah,
undistracted way,
yeah,
and appreciate that complexity and how that is just a literally mind exploding kind of thing. And maybe that's where the other mushrooms come into play. And maybe that's where these psychedelics and things like that maybe allow for a different way of kind of, whoa, that is just
yes,
mind
absolutely.
blowing, if I can use that term.
Yeah, I like this. I like this. Yeah, and yeah, you did very well there, Tim. We can move on to that. Yeah, very nice. Yeah, and this is, I realized, what did I walk past the other day? I was in a bookshop with my sister, a really beautiful bookshop, and I saw John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. I don't know if you've read it, but anyway, I
Oh,
read
yeah,
it.
I read it.
I've read it a while ago, but I really don't feel an attraction to that type of. It's quite a literal, moralizing book, and it's a story, but it's not really a story. It's a story that seems to have come out of the industrial age or the Christian kind of post-Christian. Or it is Christian. It's a very Christian book. It's very logical. Very. It's very different to the myths. It's very different to the myths, which are full of symbols and full of the archetypes and the gods and living things that you can relate to. In the animistic tradition, the animistic peoples, they relate to the natural world in a very personal way. It's a very personal relationship, and things. The Sami people walking through the landscape, they have a name for that that particularly, a protruding rock. They'll have a name for it because that's something that they're relating to in the landscape, or a particularly old pine. They have a name for it, and then they have a relationship to it, and over generations they'll have stories around it. So the landscape is alive. The landscape it's a very real interaction with other living organisms.
So maybe,
That's a
I love that.
story.
I love that. Maybe we as parents and families can start creating stories
Yeah,
in our own neighborhoods.
yeah,
Like, I've got this beautiful oak I walk past, and it's just, I mean, it's such a presence, and I need to make a story around it and tell my children and take them there, and so they can feel that the connection I have. Maybe they don't feel it, but at least they know I had that.
yeah.
And so maybe
Absolutely,
we can start creating more stories for ourselves in our communities, and that
absolutely.
brings more meaning and connection.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. Absolutely, absolutely. That is actually an incredible amount of healing. I feel would come out of this if we could, if
To
we could.
connect us in a more, that's really, I'm so grateful for this conversation, because that's really crystallized something for me, and something that others can do too, with their friends and families.
I can't hear you, Tim, for some reason.
I said I'm really grateful for this conversation, because it's crystallized that for me, in terms of, like, I always talk about how can we help people connect more to nature, but we need to make stories around it, and that means, like, hey, this rock,
Yeah,
how about this,
yeah,
and look at
yeah,
this amazing tree, and this
yeah,
happened to me when I sat under this tree, and
yeah,
those kind of things might help us connect in a more meaningful way with
yeah.
nature.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think more than trying to, I don't know, trying to like, yeah. precipitate out a movement or something. I think it's really important that it's a very independent and individual thing. So you know how you came to the festival alone, like that was quite significant. I remember we were talking about it. That was quite significant for you, and you were then free to engage in the people, in the process, in the events, as you, just as you. And I think that's really important. I can't really emphasize enough how important it is to go out alone as you, as just your own soul, to go out alone and spend time in the natural world. And it's beautiful to do that with a companion or with children, but it must also, there must be a time where you are alone with the beings, and you can exchange and interact with the beings alone, and then it becomes a very authentic relationship, a very real relationship with the spirits of this forest, with the organisms, with the beings, and then from there you can introduce other entities.
Man, I love it. It's so great because that just speaks to something I've been working on, which is to help people do, let's call it a nature immersion, a solo nature immersion, and so many people are afraid of doing that, being on their own, particularly women feeling afraid in out in nature or just being on their own in an unknown space. So creating a little template for them, like this is what you can take, and let's not, maybe you can just go for a little, like a whole day's picnic on your own, and leave your phone on silent, and voice, and then just maybe. So I've got this idea in my mind, and I'm probably going to do a little podcast on it just to introduce ways of doing that, and then building it up to spending an overnight, and
Yeah,
maybe including some fasting with that or something else,
that's
and
it.
just kind of
That's it.
sort of progressive ways of getting us more in tune. So thank you for bringing that out. Ah, beautiful, man. Muji, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on, and I know we're going to have some more chats. But before we go, I just want to tell the listeners about some of the products that you make, because this is our plug for you. And at the festival I went to, Muji had this amazing tonic, this cola tonic that he made himself, and it is absolutely brilliant. And he also makes these fantastic medicinal teas. So, Muji, if you can just tell us a little bit about those and where they can source them, and then I'll also put everything in the show notes so that people can just click on the link.
Perfect. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, thank you for mentioning it. So yeah, at the festival, we had chai. So we're hand blending chai to a formula that I made a couple of years ago now. And it's really good. It's a really good chai. It's got, I think, 7 or 8 different spices in it, and we blend it ourselves, prepare it ourselves, and then seal it. And it's available on the website if you want to buy that. The cola tonic is a really exciting product. So the cola tonic is a multi-layered tonic. It's an extract. You can buy it as a syrup, as an extracted syrup. So it's an elixir basically, which is what, yeah, it's like a sweetened herbal extract. And it contains cola nut, which has caffeine and related compounds to caffeine, calatidine, and other stimulant compounds. But it's quite gently stimulating, not like coffee, but it does contain stimulant compounds. Just be aware of that. Underneath that, so if you have coffee every day, people have coffee every day, it will start to fatigue you and because you're basically stimulating the sympathetic nervous system, and you're increasing certain hormones, stress hormones, and they have metabolic consequences. So you're really, someone mentioned it at the festival, you're stealing from the future with coffee, and it's really true. Well, with caffeine you are, but with the cola nut it's a bit different. So it's a little bit more balanced, and then, like I said, it's not such a high dose of any one particular compound. It's a little bit easier on the body. But in any case, we've added ashwagandha as another layer. So ashwagandha as a medicinal root from India. So the kola nut is from Africa. This ashwagandha is from India. It's a root of a plant, and it's used to increase tolerance to stress. So we know in studies it's shown in increased tolerance to aerobic stress and recovery time after aerobic exercise. And we also know that it regulates the cortisol on the HPA axis, so the hypopituitary and the hypothalamus and adrenal gland axis, where we know, where we know when we're in a stress response, that axis is stimulated. Yeah, so I won't say more about that, but that's ashwagandha. Then the mushrooms in there is reishi, shiitake, maitake, cordyceps, lion's mane, chaga. And that layer is to encourage the immune system. It's also acting as an adaptogenic action similar to ashwagandha. So those three layers are working. So if you're taking something stimulant, you're also adding and benefiting your body in the long term. So if you're taking it every day, you've basically changed a habit, quite a harmful habit of intaking caffeine into actually a tonic, which you take and you improve your system. I'm training every day, and I use it to help me to go, but also I know that I'm imbibing certain medicinal plants and fungi that are going to be helping me in the long term. So that's the Cola
Fantastic.
tonic, and it tastes pretty good.
It tastes really nice. It tastes really nice. I love it. I think
Thank
it's
you, Tim.
brilliant. I don't drink Coke, but it gives me that memory of Coke and that nice part of the Coke taste, and with all these amazing things in
Yeah,
it. So I'm a big fan. So we can get that at forestmedicine.org.uk. That's the website, and as I said, I'll have that in the show notes.
thanks,
So
Tim.
go and click on that and order yourself a couple of bottles.
Perfect. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for listening. If you've got any questions, I'll put Muji's email in the show notes too, so you can fire them off at him. If you've got any questions for me or any suggestions, I'd really appreciate those. Thanks so much, guys. Cheers.
Thanks, Tim.